Imagine being a soil biologist and genetic engineer working for Agriculture Canada for 30 years, really thinking that chemical farming and GMOs were safe, and then discovering that chemical farming was actually making people sick. This is part of Dr. Thierry Vrain's story. In 2019, I had the privilege of honor of sitting down with him and having an interview and conversation about why we actually need to rethink the way we grow our food, how glyphosate is impacting our health and the health of the planet. And Thierry is really good at breaking glyphosate down into helping us understand how it's working in our body and how it's tearing our body apart, literally. And then we talk about what we can do to reclaim our health and have agency in creating our well-being. I'm Natalie Forsbauer, founder and editor-in-chief of Heart and Soul magazine. I'm really excited that you're part of this conversation. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the videos, and share them if it resonates. And if you haven't grabbed a subscription to Heart and Soul magazine yet, be sure to hop on over to heartandsoulmagazine.com and grab yours for just $39.99 a year. Enjoy this conversation with Dr. Thierry Vrain and make yourself an amazing day.
My background, let's see, I came from France when I was 25 years old. I taught at the University of Quebec in Montreal 2 years. That was my military service for France. Stayed in Canada, was hired by Canada and worked with Canada for 30 years as a research scientist in soil biology. That was my major, so to speak. So I was working with nematodes. That was my research, little microscopic worms, you're familiar. Basically learning how to kill them best, how to sterilize the soil best, etc., etc. Then mid-career, because funding for nematode research was really not great, and I could see all my colleagues around me doing molecular biology, getting all kinds of monies. I thought, oh, why not? So I learned DNA, and I did get money, and I became a molecular biologist and a genetic engineer, and that's how I finished my career. And I was the head of a big group in Summerland, and then I retired and came here 2 years later. Yeah.
So before we get into what glyphosate is and the GMO and stuff like that, I'm curious, because you're deep into the culture of promoting and teaching about the benefits of GMOs, and I'm wondering what changed for you.
When I was working for Canada, my boss, the head of the director of the institute, just had nothing to do with DNA or molecular biology, so I kind of, because that was my field, I kind of took it upon myself to speak publicly, and he totally let me do that. And so I spoke everywhere I could to reassure people that there's not really anything inherently bad or dangerous or stupid about doing this kind of research in the lab. We've been doing DNA work now for 30, 40 years, and I could say, much, if not most, of the development, much of the progress that we've done in all kinds of basic science, including medicine, is because of this technology. So in the lab, it's like nothing can go wrong. So this is my background. And then I married this woman who's very organic. And when we met, on our second meeting, she started talking about GMOs, and I just cut her short and said, darling, you don't know shit. It's like, sorry, you don't know anything about it, let me tell you. She was patient. Anyway, but then after a few years later, I realized, I'm keeping up a bit with the research, I realized there's something funny is going on. There are lots of research papers showing that animals fed GMOs are getting sick or dying. And that's was beyond intriguing, and so I dug a little bit, and then finally had to conclude that maybe I was wrong, maybe there was something wrong with GMOs. But I just couldn't. I made up a story about, you know, possibly it's possible in theory that if when it's done the DNA interferes with the genes and some proteins are rogue proteins and maybe become toxic. Proteins can be very toxic, etc., etc. I wasn't quite satisfied with my story, and this is 2013. I gave a TED talk, and then soon after that a public lecture in Surrey, a couple of hundred people, and then the anti-GMO crowd just grabbed me and said, well, would you go around Canada, would you lecture around Canada, you know, we could arrange everything. And I said, okay, sure, I can do that. And so I started southern BC and Alberta, and that was November, December 2013. And then as I was doing that, I really realized, looking more into it, that all the animals that were fed GMOs were fed plants that had been sprayed with a particular chemical. And when I looked into it, there were already several people doing research on the toxicity of glyphosate. Mm-hmm. And so that was that. And so I finished my tour of Canada, now changing my tune. It wasn't about GMOs so much anymore, it was about glyphosate. And the anti-GMO crowd just totally wanted nothing to do with me.
Right.
Because I turned coat.
Mm. And do you think, do you still have questions about GMOs? And their safety, and the safety of GMOs?
GMOs are, as far as I know, are safe, and there's never been an incident that I'm aware of in the lab.
Okay.
Great for research.
Yeah.
What Monsanto did, and now of course several other chemical industries have done that too, is to take that technology and adapt it to field products, mm-hmm. to crops. Mm-hmm. And so now we have GMO potatoes, we have GMO this and GMO that, but you will have noticed over the years that basically none of that research, none of that development have become popular or commercially viable. Mm-hmm. The only progress, the only viable thing has been the herbicide, you know, whether it's Monsanto or Bayer or Dow, or it's all the same technology, it's herbicide resistance.
Mm-hmm. And what is glyphosate?
Glyphosate is a very tiny molecule. It is an analog of a 2-carbon amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. The smallest amino acid is called glycine, 2 carbons, very tiny molecule. And then you put a little tail on that, and you have what is called an amino acid analog. It looks like an amino acid, but it's a little bit different. And it has incredible properties. It can bind very avidly to all kinds of metals. And that's how it started its career, basically, to be used as something that could grab onto metals. And then, of course, Monsanto discovered it, or rediscovered it, and turned it into a herbicide.
Right. And when you say it was being used for metals, what was it being used specifically for? It
was used to clean up boilers and pipes where you boil water, and after a few weeks, a few months, the pipes get covered with dust, with mineral dust. Mm-hmm. You can't go into your pipes to clean them up, so you need a chemical to do that. That's a normal process, and glyphosate is fantastic at doing it.
Mm. And then from there.
And then they realized, because if you clean up your pipes and boilers and dispose of your dirty solution somewhere in nature, you realize instantly that you're killing the plants and the trees. Oh, but that could be useful. What a herbicide you have. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Glyphosate kills plants. It kills plants because it interferes with the way plants make their proteins. Certain amino acids follow a certain biochemical pathway. It's called the Shikimate pathway, and glyphosate interferes with that. So the plant cells cannot make their own amino acid, cannot make their proteins, and therefore they die instantly. And so, okay, so when glyphosate was introduced and patented as a herbicide by Monsanto, and went through the regulatory chain with EPA, etc., they said, well, it's a wonderful product, and it kills the plants according to a certain biochemistry that animals do not have. Animals are completely immune to this chemical. We do not have the biochemistry. Therefore, in theory, we're completely immune. There's no possible toxicity to animals of any kind. What we didn't really realize 50 years ago is that animals are not what we thought they are. They were. Animals are all symbiotic organisms. Animals are all colonized by bacteria. And of course, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've learned an awful lot about the human microbiome. The microbiome is, as you probably know already, a huge number of species of bacteria in our colon, in our gut, that do all kinds of things, wonderful things for our body, and we truly are symbiotic organisms. It turns out that bacteria make their amino acids exactly the same way that plants do. And we didn't know that, or at least it was easy to not know it 50 years ago. And so therefore, all animals have a microbiome, all animals are susceptible to glyphosate, because their microbiome will be decimated by this chemical. This chemical kills bacteria as well as it kills plants. So it's not just a herbicide, it is truly an antibiotic. Just like penicillin or streptomycin or doxycycline, it is actually a very powerful antibiotic. And the amazing thing is that Monsanto patented it as an antibiotic in 2010, I think. They filed their patent in 2001, but got it in 2010. It's out in the open.
Well, and aren't they using it? Isn't it being used
in modern medicine? It was patented as an antibiotic that could kill the malaria agent. So imagine if it had worked. I mean, if you go and travel in Africa, you take doxycycline, which I did many times. This is an antibiotic. You take doxycycline, it will definitely work on your microbiome, but at least you're not getting malaria. So they were thinking of using glyphosate as a new antibiotic that could kill the malaria agent, and it does. It's very potent. But the interesting thing, of course, is that it was never followed up because it will kill the patients as well.
I'm wondering why glyphosate is so bad, and what it's like, what makes it so different, and should it be all pesticides that we're concerned about, or is glyphosate specifically?
I think glyphosate is as toxic, or perhaps slightly more toxic than most. But many pesticides are extremely toxic. But glyphosate was the first one to be sprayed on food. We've never sprayed atrazine on food. We've never sprayed any other herbicide on food. When Monsanto invented GMOs in 1996 with corn and soy and then, the other crops after that, that was the very first time that we sprayed a herbicide on food crops. And then a few years later, they invented spraying grain and seeds crops right before harvest. Might as well spray your plate.
With glyphosate.
Yeah. So this is an antibiotic. And we have antibiotic residues in our food, in the food system. Glyphosate has been extremely popular in the farming community. It's perfectly normal. This has become completely normal and routine to spray food crops. This is the first time it was done. And so, of course, after that, seeing that, you know, how popular it was and how much money there was to be done, well, yes, of course, Dow Chemical and Bayer and probably a few more came up with their own GMO crops to transform, you know, to genetically alter the crop so that it becomes resistant to the herbicide. It's not really any different than what bacteria do when they become resistant to an antibiotic, because it is not just a herbicide, it is an antibiotic. So you want the plant to be resistant, you just introduce an antibiotic resistance gene, which you can find in bacteria. It's easy. And that's what Monsanto did.
And so we're having to use stronger and stronger pesticides in order to kill the weeds that are becoming...
That's a different, that's a different story. Of course, the plants become resistant, therefore you need more, or you need a different, and so you have something like endless duo. Now it's like glyphosate and 2,4-D. Yeah. It's like, where are we going?
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
Very scary. Do you know what percentage of glyphosate goes into desiccation, and what percentage of glyphosate goes into?
No, I don't.
Using it as a herbicide?
I have no idea, but I do know that it is very normal, very routine. It's an insurance for the farmers. You know, if you have a field of wheat, 100 acres or 1,000 acres of wheat, and in Saskatchewan or Alberta or somewhere, and of course it cannot be fully homogeneous. So it's still a little bit green over there, and it's fully ripe over here, but not quite over here, etc. And you're in August, you're in September, the nights are getting cold, you don't want to lose your crop, so therefore you spray glyphosate, your crop, your plants will be killed next week, therefore they will be dry, mature. I call it chemical ripening. That's what it is. And it's totally normal today. And that's why, as of the last few years, people get really excited now because we find residues of glyphosate in cereals, in kids' food, but it's not just for the kids, it's everywhere in the food store.
And why should we care? Like, why should we?
Well, you should care. I certainly have changed my food habits in the last 10 years. You know, I mean, as a scientist, working with soil sterilization, etc., I was very clearly told that there's no way herbicide can affect us, because we're not plants after all, we're very different. Well, it turns out we're not that different, and yes, they do affect us. Glyphosate is even worse because it is truly an antibiotic. It does kill bacteria. So, why should we care? Because, and that also something that I became really interested in the last few years, because of our microbiome. Our microbiome, the medical research establishment now is all over it. It's just incredible what they're discovering. It's a super organ, this microbiome. It's basically in charge of running all our internal organs. We are not running, I am not running my liver, my kidneys, my brain, my heart. So who's running the show? It turns out that there's this amazing community of bacteria in my gut that speak to each other constantly and speak to all my organs. This is recent research. This is documented. Knowing that, it becomes absolutely obvious that what I put in my mouth is the environment of the bacteria in my microbiome. And if I want my body to be happy and healthy, my microbiome has to be happy and healthy, and therefore the food I put in my mouth is important. Extremely important. There's no, you could teach that to a 3-year-old. It's really not complicated at all.
Yeah, I agree. Thierry, can you speak at all to the because what I'm hearing is it's really important that we get glyphosate and these maybe pesticides to come in the future off of our and out of our food system. And yes, they're being sprayed on the forests and on our playgrounds and on our school grounds, and our food is being showered in it. And I'm wondering, Health Canada has taken a really strong position to allow it, and I'm wondering what we can do to move the needle.
Other than, you know, speaking to your friends, your family, your neighbors, making sure they understand that the food they put in their mouth is contaminated, and therefore change the system, so to speak. I mean, if you don't buy that food, obviously the food will change. The stores do, Costco does. I mean, all kinds of stores are now in on it. Glyphosate, Roundup, being very toxic, is a herbicide. And a lot of people don't like to hear what I'm saying right now. So you'll have to bear with it. It's a fantastic herbicide. It really kills all plants. Most herbicides kill some plants, most plants. You have to mix, you have to add, you have to, you know, and glyphosate is the answer to that. It basically kills all plants. So until 1996, when we started spraying it on food crops, it was used as a herbicide. And used as a herbicide as it should be, as it is done in most of Europe, etc., and many other places. Basically, the residues in the soil are not that much. I'm talking residues in the food, so to speak, in the following crop. So I'm not necessarily advocating to ban glyphosate of every use. Like right now, I live next to the woods, and when I go and walk in my woods over there in the forest, sometimes there's a sign, a herbicide has been applied here because there's an invasive weed. I know very well it's glyphosate. It's a spot spraying. Is it horrible? Is it terrible? Should it be out of the question? I'm not sure. Because after all, this is how we live. And so banning glyphosate from all use, I'm not the one first in line to do that. I am the one first in line to say, ban it on food crops, period. That I have no tolerance for because of its effect on the microbiome. It's an antibiotic. When people understand that it is antibiotic and it kills the bacteria in our gut, you know, it's easy. Yeah.
Google, and I can't remember who else, I was looking for the article but couldn't find it, are targeting people who are speaking out against raising awareness around glyphosate, for example. And so my question is, how do we rally? How do we, I mean, aside from maybe your answer is the same, it's change the way you, like how you buy your food or change the foods you eat. How do we rally against the big corporation and big money and big lobbying to create change in our food system? So even if you had what's one thing we can do, or two things, or three things?
Other than, you know, raising awareness so that more and more and more people become aware of it and choose their food differently. We live in a market society, you know. If you stop buying a certain product, the product will disappear. So if you stop buying food, if you become really aware that most of the food in the store is contaminated, and you try very hard, and it becomes your first priority to buy clean food, which of course will be more expensive, by the way, because most of it is organic. I was extremely, it almost cost me my marriage 6-7 years ago, because I'm OCD. I'm definitely, when I do something, I do it. I've retired. The last 4, 5, 6 years, I was like, okay, enough. I'm still available. I still go and talk, etc. And by the way, have you looked at some of my videos online? Okay.
Yeah, lots.
Good. You're welcome to borrow whatever you want from any of that. Of course. So other than basically feeding yourself differently and letting everybody know around you why you're doing that, I don't know how to do it other than raising hell or making a documentary, reaching people. You know, there's so many people who have tried hard to bring up the awareness, and we're up against so much money. You know, you're familiar with Carrie Gillen's book? Yeah. I've got half a shelf of books like this.
Right.
That one after another have been published, and you know, and a lot of people are speaking up. Zach Bush has spoken up a lot, etc., etc.
Yeah. And what about, some people feel like they can't afford organics, or they can't afford to make those choices. So what would you say to them? So two questions. What do you say? And then also, does it make a difference even if we only buy like a pound of apples organically? You know, does that make a difference if we can only buy one thing organically, and that's the way we start?
The people who tell me that they can't afford, they're too poor to afford organic food, clean food. So let's say they call it organic. Let's say it's double the price, which sometimes it is, and not all the time, of course. And my answer to that is, personally, if my budget was very limited, I think I would ride the bus. I would sell my car, I would ride the bus, I would ride a bicycle, I would sell my TV, I would not go on holiday, I would live extremely simply and healthy. Because I don't want to have chronic diseases like many people have these days by age 30 or 40, or have cancer by age 40, and etc. And that affects your life, impacts your life so much. It's incredible. You know what you put in your mouth is the most important thing in your whole life. It impacts your health, it impacts your mood, your brain, it impacts people around you, it impacts your family. It's like, so I don't know, in my book you'd have to be incredibly poor not to be able to afford good food. Forget everything else. Nothing else comes close. Nothing else is important. What you put in your mouth is the most important act.
Truth. Truth. And on that, tell me how, what have you noticed since you've changed what you put in your mouth?
I certainly have noticed that a lot of, as you saw at lunch, we have 3 to 5 young folks with us, 8 months of the year, and many comes, and they're gluten-free. They're vegan because of this or that reason. They're celiac. They're in their 20s. Now, what is this celiac thing? The gluten-free, what does that come from? As a species, the human species, we've been eating grain for 10,000 years. We've been eating gluten for 10,000 years. 99.9% of all human beings are perfectly fine with gluten. And then suddenly in the last 20 years, 40 to 50% of North Americans cannot stand gluten? What's going on? So back to what I was just telling you about, what you put in your mouth is the most important thing. I don't know that I've noticed anything about me, changing my diet, other than I don't feel anxious about what I put in my mouth. Like so many people, I really see it, I notice it, I hear it. People are anxious about the food they put in their mouth. That's the most horrible thing. Mm. Imagine drinking water and kind of wondering if you're going to get sick from that.
Mm-hmm. So I heard you make a link between celiac and gluten intolerance. And what is the direct link?
There's a paper by Samzel and Seneff in 2013, I think, where they basically explain the causation between celiac and glyphosate toxicity. I mean, celiac is basically an autoimmune disease. It's like, okay, the gluten molecule is now deadly. It's your microbiome that decides that. Your microbiome is 100% in charge of your immune system. All your immune cells are taught by the bacteria in your microbiome. And they learn from your microbiome what is a good molecule and what isn't, and what to react to and what not to react to. And gluten is definitely one of them. And so basically, if you're healthy, your immune system knows very well that you don't need to overreact to gluten. It's perfectly fine. So it's not really a gluten sensitivity, it is a glyphosate sensitivity.
And do you think there's a relationship between people becoming antibiotic resistant and the amount of glyphosate
no,
that
your question makes no sense. People do not become antibiotic resistant. Okay, so I'm correcting your language. People do not become antibiotic resistant. There's no such thing. Bacteria become antibiotic resistant. So the more, I mean, the dogma in medicine is basically, and all the medical people are telling us, we're using too much antibiotic in medicine. We're using, I forget the numbers now, but we're using a lot of antibiotic in the medical system. And the more we use antibiotics, the more bacteria come into contact with the molecule, and it doesn't take them that long to learn to become resistant. That happened, you know, with penicillin 50 years ago, and then one after another, after another, after another, and we constantly invent new ones, and they learn to detoxify that as well. So bacteria exposed to antibiotics become resistant faster than if they were not exposed to it, or very rarely. So yes, the medical people tell us the more we use them, the faster they will become resistant. What most people don't know is that we feed our animals. The animals that we eat, the pigs, the chickens, the cattle, are fed antibiotics very routinely because of the way they're raised. They're raised in very stressful situation. Instead of being in nature as they normally would be, or on a pasture, they're raised in a CAFU, in this intensive park lots with thousands of them and nothing to graze, and there's antibiotic in their food to prevent inflammation or whatever, and this is not my field of work. So we use 10 times more antibiotics for animals than we use for humans, with exactly the same effect again. The more you use antibiotics, the faster the bacteria will become resistant. And of course, what practically nobody understands, or it is not well known and not well publicized, if glyphosate is an antibiotic, which it is patented as an antibiotic, then we are using antibiotics for weed control, and we are using millions of tons every year. We're using 10 times more again than for the animals, just to spray in the landscape to control weeds. Well, imagine what that does to the bacteria that become in contact. And the research has been done in New Zealand in the fall of 2017. That was published in the fall of 2017, a scientific publication showing, it's very simple research, really. It's grade 12 research, you know. It's like put bacteria in a petri dish, put a little bit of glyphosate, put something else in, and see what happens. And it's very obvious that bacteria exposed to glyphosate become resistant to other antibiotics much faster than without the glyphosate.
Grateful you joined us for that conversation and interview. If you haven't subscribed to Heart and Soil Magazine yet, head over to heartandsoilmagazine.com, click on that subscribe button, and join us for just $39.99 a year. You make yourself an amazing day, and I'm really grateful you're part of our community.